curious about how the Indian state really works, its levers of power, tech ambitions, and geopolitical maneuvers. Explore it all through one of three specializations in our 12-week graduate certificate in public policy. Applications close August 24th.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to this episode of All Things Policy, your favorite daily public policy podcast from the Takshashila Institution. In today's episode, we continue this show's fine tradition of unpacking the big shifts shaping our world today. We're going to be talking about trade, tariffs, and the global economy's never-ending entanglement and obsession with China. I'm Anushka Saxena, your host for today's episode and a staff research analyst with the Takshashila Institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program. Now, just to set the context, for many years now, and especially since the COVID-19 pandemic, it's become sort of a popular argument that China's export-led growth model is on its last legs because supply chains are diversifying, tariffs keep piling up, and geopolitics looks increasingly hostile from Beijing's perspective. Exports aren't really doing so well. And so the model that China grew and thrived on is now, as it were, nearing its end, or at least nearing the end of its glory years. And yet, the latest half-year trade figures for 2025 at least tell to me a different story. China's exports are rising. Its trade surplus with most economies remains huge, and its impact on the global economy hasn't really gone away, which is why we know how difficult it has been to answer the questions surrounding decoupling and de-risking. And just as a quick primer before I have my guest for today go into detail on this, the H1 trade figures look a little something like this. China's total foreign trade in the first half of 2025 was up by 1.8%. Export was up by 5.9%, and this is year on year. And import was down by 3.9%. And even if you look at entities that are in a managed competitive state with China, like the European Union, exports were up by 6.6%, while imports were down. And trade with ASEAN has also expanded by a whopping 8%, with exports growing by 13%. And now the trade with US and Russia has gone down, yes, and for, of course, meritable reasons, but it seems prima facie to have been offset by the other numbers. So, is China's export machine really sputtering, or have we underestimated its resilience? To explore this exact question, I'm joined today by Amit Kumar, my colleague, who recently also wrote an insightful piece attempting to answer this very question. Welcome to the show, Amit.
Thank you so much, Anushka. Pleasure to be here.
Right. So, let's get right into it, right? China's exports, as we discussed, rose nearly 6% in the first half of 2025, even as imports declined. And that really seems to counter, at least at the outset, the China slowdown narrative that we're often hearing. So, Amit, my first question to you is, do you think we've been too quick to declare the end of China's export-led growth model? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Anushka, for that question. I think the fact that we see that every H1 data, every month or the quarter's data that China keeps releasing with respect to trade, I think we have observed a consistent trend where the exports have risen and imports have also, in some cases, risen, in some cases, it has fallen down. But trade, I think the percentage increase is something which has been consistent over the past few years. And begs the question, as you rightly said, Did we discount the China's export-led growth model a little too early? And a few other questions. What could come to your mind would be: are we witnessing a resurgence of exports, especially after the pandemic? Uh, and if the opposite is true, and China's export led growth model has indeed run its course, isn't the world, maybe playing the China shock threat? So, to quickly answer and very briefly answer your question, and we can get into detail later, I think if we look at the data, it suggests to me, at least, that we have not discounted China's export model quite early. I think it's a given and established fact that China's growth led model, export led growth model, is no longer sustaining. But at the same time, the proposition that there has been a resurgence of exports and that we are not overplaying the China threat is something that can coexist with this, the primary proposition.
All right. So, um, okay, let's take this proposition, right? That the glory years of China's export led growth model seem to be behind it. But at the same time, exports can still be rising and there can be some resilience in the numbers. So, can you unpack this apparent contradiction for our listeners?
Yes. So if one has to answer the question whether trade or exports is still playing that role that it used to in the yesteryears, I think the data point that we have to look at is trade as percentage of GDP and exports as percentage of GDP. This would give us a clearer picture and insights into whether that model is sustaining or not. So, if you look at this data over the past 50, 60 years, you find that China's total trade as a percentage of its GDP, it has fluctuated over the years quite a bit. So, if I have to just divide the economic history of China into three or four phases, during Mao's years, trade contributed only about 8% of the GDP. Uh, and the second phase, which took place after, which came after Mao's demise, and from 1978, the reform and opening up era, until China's accession to WTO in 2001, that was Jiang Zemin's era. If you look at this period from 1978 to 2001, this contribution, the contribution of trade, of course, averaged about 26%. So this is about what, 18% rise if on average you'll compare it to the Mao's years. And in the period thereafter, from 2002 to 2013, which is when Xi Jinping took over, right? This average contribution, that is of trade, as a percentage of GDP, soared to a colossal 51% in this period. And even you had a high of 63% in 2006. So clearly, the total trade as a percent of GDP was witnessing a humongous rise. And this was actually the period where you attributed, and this attribution that China is an export led economy came into being. And since then, if you see from 2013, total trade as a percentage of GDP has averaged around 33%, which is a huge drop from the average of 51% from the period between 2002 and 2013. And in this later period, if you see, export is contributing about 19% to the GDP. And this is a drop from about 28, 29%, which used to be the case in 2002, 2013 period, the glorious years of China's exports, if you could say that. So if you look at this data, the contribution of trade and exports as a percentage of GDP has seen a drastic decline. And therefore, this suggests that we are actually past that glory age. Trade is not contributing as much to China's domestic economy, the GDP. So that case is settled. We are well past that glory years, and we are not returning to those glory years, and trade does not contribute that much to China's GDP.
All right. And yet, we are yet to discuss that bit about how the numbers still continue to rise, right? And just to add on to that question, and maybe you can address both together, you talked about how trade as a percentage of GDP has gone down from about 51% to about 33% today. And so, can we also read this as a sign of, say, China successfully rebalancing its economy toward domestic consumption? Or is it just more evidence of structural decline? Like, what are the reasons and the factors behind these numbers going down, as it were?
Right. So to answer the first part of your question, whether how do we read this whole rise in exports, etc., and the fact that is the world right in uh, calling this phase wherein you're encountering the China shock, and how do we read this situation? So another metric that there are two metrics that you can look at. One of the metric is that you look at uh, trade balance as a percentage of GDP. So if you look at this data over the years, and why this is important is that how much of a trade surplus or trade deficit does China contributes to its GDP, right? So if you look at again the economic history or the trade balance history from 1978 to 2001, it averaged around, if I'm not wrong, about zero or even was in negative in the period between 1978 and 2001. And before that, I think during the Mao's years, it was negative. And even though it started recording consistent trade surpluses from 1994. So the important point here is that from after the reform era, that is 1978, until China's accession to the WTO, its trade surplus as a percentage of GDP was about zero. It averaged zero in this period. But interesting thing happened between the period from 2002 to 2013. And this was again, mind you, as we discussed, that this was the glory years of China's trading history or the export-led growth model. The period between 2002 to 2013, trade surplus as a percentage of GDP was somewhere around 4%. Again, and this showed the dominance of China in the global trading order. And this average, well, again, after Xi Jinping took over, it sustained for next 3 years. And it was also the effect of the global financial crisis that happened 2008, 2009. And therefore, we saw the effects started to become much more pronounced in the years after. And until 2017, I would say, this momentum sustained. And you saw that there was a trade surplus as percentage of GDP, kept its average to near about 4%. But in the period from 2018 to 2020, this was a period where Chinese exports were not doing quite well. 2018 was a low point. And then you saw a pandemic strike in 2019, and the whole of 2020 was under the shadow of pandemic, and you saw exports worldwide fall quite drastically, right? And therefore, in this period, for the brief 3 to 4 year period, you saw that China's trade surplus decline to 3%. But what is interesting is that between 2021 and 2024, in the last 4 years, this average has rebounded and to magnificent positive upwards of 4.5%. And this is very significant, right? This tells me that even as China's total trade as a percentage of GDP has declined, its trade surplus as a percentage of GDP has remained constant and even has surpassed the average that it witnessed during the glory years. And why this is significant is what it means is China is still offloading the same amount of trade surplus in percentage terms into the world market as it was during its peak years. Now, one might a logical corollary of or the logical question that would follow is that one could turn up and question the fact that there has been a decline in trade as a percentage of GDP. This would have mitigated or reduced the impact of trade surpluses as a percentage of GDP on the global economy, right? And this is a fair question. But This doesn't seem to be happening. So even if you look at, if I give you a situation or a thought experiment, let's do a thought experiment. So even with reduced total trade, which today averages 33% of GDP, of which exports stand about close to about 19%, and imports are about 15% in the past 4 years. This is the past 4 year data that I'm looking at. Uh, if you calculate the difference, it would mean that China offloaded a trade surplus of about 4% of its GDP into the global market. And you could remember that in 2024, the number that came up, and we were all surprised, and we were all taken back with the figure that China recorded a record trade surplus of nearly $1 trillion in 2024. So this was what it was equivalent to. Now let's do a thought experiment. Uh, the scenario that I just discussed is what the present scenario is. But let's do a thought experiment, and that had China's current trading figures mirrored the figures of its peak years, with exports making up for about 28% of the GDP and imports making up for 24% of GDP. It would still have offloaded a trade surplus equivalent to 4% of its GDP into the global economy, and which would still come up to about $1 trillion. So the impact, and when it comes to impact on the global economy, it is still having the same impact that it would have about 20 years ago during the glory years of China's trading history. And the second question was about the rebalancing, is it?
Yeah, what, in your opinion, possibly explains where the decline in numbers vis-a-vis trade as a percentage of GDP has kind of gone? Is it that this reduction in exports or trade as a major contributor to the Chinese economy now translated into domestic consumption becoming more important? And by the way, fascinating analysis on the percentages and how the numbers mimic the impact China had on the world economy from its glory years of 2002 to 13 to today, right? And this really means that the volume and the surplus vis-a-vis export from China's perspective has really gone up and shot up in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. So a few points for resilience on that. But just could you also answer an additional question beside the bit about rebalancing, right? Um, so, effectively, does this analysis then tell us that the fears of at least dumping are way too real and must be addressed at the earliest?
Yes, I'll answer your second question first. So, yes, I think the fear of China shock or dumping, because most of the exports, the Chinese exports that we talk about, have unfair trade advantages and do not go through the kind of competition that the West calls for. It's not exactly a competitive situation, or it's not exactly a result of comparative advantage that the Chinese exports are have taken over the world market, right? So there is a concern, and the concern is legitimate. And I forgot to point out the second metric that I was supposed to discuss in the previous question when I was looking at trade surplus as a percentage of GDP. The second metric that you could look at is China's exports as a percentage of global exports. So it somewhere around, and past 20 years, you would see since its accession to the WTO in 2001, it has significantly and consistently risen to about today 14%, and has stabilized around 14%. And this has been a gradual increase, incremental increase over the past 20 years. So, yes, even though the role of trade in China's economy has declined, its impact on the global economy has increased, in fact. The second question with regards to rebalancing, and I think it's a great question, that if trade indeed is going downwards and is not playing the kind of role that it used to in the previous years, does it mean that the Chinese economy is rebalancing? But I'm afraid I have to say that that is not the case, because while the numbers have gone down, the breakup of trade, I mean, when you look at the breakup of household consumption, if one of the driving factors of China's of any GDP or any economy, if you look at those numbers, household consumption today contributes less than 40% of China's GDP. And there's no other country, major country in the world with an economy as big as China, or even a comparable economy as China's, where the numbers are this low. And I mean, if you look at, again, you go back in history and look at the trend, how the numbers have progressed during the Mao's years, the 1950s to 1977. China had a very healthy household consumption contribution from household consumption to the GDP. It was about 58%. And mind you, today the global average is about 60%. So that is something where the numbers should lie. On any deviation from that would tell you if consumption is playing the kind of role that you would want it to play in an economy, right? So during Mao's years, consumption had a pretty healthy contribution to its China's GDP. But in the period, the period between the reforms and China's accession to the WTO, this contribution to household consumption's contribution fell to about 50%, which is again not great or near anywhere near the global average, but still a healthy rate, a healthy contribution. But things started to change after, again, 2001. And you'd see that after 2001, the contribution, if you look at, take out the average, it falls up somewhere around 38%. Now, that is absolutely low. No other country. As I told you that the global average is around 60. US's average is about 70%. UK is also around 70. Even the most other export led countries which rely on exports to fuel the economy, such as Germany and South Korea, even their contribution has been around 50% of the GDP. So what this does is, if you look at the scale of Chinese economy, these numbers mean a lot. Even in aggregate terms, this would, because of the scale of China's economy, this 38% would put China at, I think, second behind the US when it comes to consumption in aggregate terms. But in percentage terms, when you look at what we're missing out, is again, the margin is very huge, and the impact on the global economy is very huge, because if China is not consuming more and China is producing, the world has to consume it. So no, to answer your question again, in short, I don't think, and the data speaks for itself. The Chinese economy is nowhere towards rebalancing. In fact, this is one of the things that the Chinese leadership is still discussing, and they want, given that the external markets are going through a lot of problems and Chinese exports have become quite controversial externally. They want to have a sustainable growth model, and that requires them to rebalance towards consumption. But this is something which has not happened.
All right. Thanks so much for that, Amit. That was quite an interesting rundown. And of course, what you've just argued basically tells the listeners, and I hope this is their takeaway, that consumption is vital for an economy as much as exports. Because if your model is anything like China's, there could be a situation where geoeconomics and geopolitics undergo a churn, and then not everything looks favorable and hunky dory. And then even if you can continue to unload the same amount of exported products as your glory years, domestically you will at least see their value go down and their contribution go down to your economy, as is the case with China today. And then it's not easy, as you pointed out, Amit, for the change or the rebalancing and the reshifting to domestic consumption to happen overnight, as it were. And yeah, of course, consumption in essence also helps offset any downfalls in trade or exports in particular, caused by crisis events like the pandemic, for example. And if you don't have that base cultivated, it can be really hard to bounce back, though China did, because of the interdependencies with the world. As you pointed out, Amit, the political dispensation's key goal now is to make that rebalance happen, because they want a more sustainable model, as it were. But thanks so much for that, Amit. And just to close the show with $1 million question, and you can give quick thoughts on this. With all of this context in mind, I think the question that I want your thoughts on is: so, are the tightened tariffs and the export restrictions placed by the US or the EU or other countries on Chinese goods Are they the solution to the dumping and the offloading that's happening today? And do you see the logic behind them? And, take your few minutes to kind of go through this for our listeners.
See, that's actually $1 million question, and something that the world has been grappling with for quite some time. And it's not as if this question has come up and has become a global problem recently. If you I mean, you follow India China relations, and you would know that trade has been one of the contentious issues in the India China relations. India has been time and again pointing out that market access is something which the Indian goods not get a greater market access in the Chinese market, and reciprocity has been something which is missing out when it comes to India China trade relations. So while the Chinese goods continue to get unimpeded access to Indian market, the same is not true for the Chinese market. And they have also been complaining about dumping of Chinese goods, although there's a brighter side to it that the consumers get to save their disposable income. They get to have lavish lives, but then there's a downside to it that it also leads to deindustrialization. So you have to balance between it and see where it goes. But mind you, that India has been pointing it out for quite some time. But I think post-pandemic period really brought this question or the issue of China's shock before the world, and the US and the EU took cognizance of that. And I think right now, I think we don't have very clear answers as to what would be a better solution, or what would be the designated solution that to deal with China's dumping. Because again, if I have to draw a parallel, I would do it with respect to, if you look at Chinese economy and how the importance of real estate to China's economy. If I have to draw a parallel, it would be what Chinese exports to the world was something was which real estate the Chinese economy was. So there was a problem, a clear recognition of the problem that real estate bubble had become a problem, and there was a reason for the Chinese leadership, to crack down on it. But when it decided to do so, it also meant that giving up on growth rates, right? So it's that kind of a situation, that kind of fix where it's a problem, but if you go and try to solve that problem, it will come and create more problems for you. It could create more problems. So ideally, you should crack down on it, but it would also give you a good amount of pain in that process. So the same is the situation with the Chinese exports as today. If you go down and crack down on it, which I think is required and needed when it comes to strategic interest, but mind you that it will also have an impact on the global economy, because there's a demand and China is the only country supplying and catering to those demands. So if you go and crack down on that thing, it'll be prepared to take some pain. As regards to what are the options available before you, I think one of the proposed option is, again, as you said, is tariff. But again, you saw how if when US and Trump tried to do that, he had to overturn it within a matter of weeks. And later, with respect to other countries, leaving China out from that 90-day truce, and eventually even giving up to the Chinese demands and accommodating Chinese concerns. And now they are back again talking, because it does create problem for your economy, which economic pain that you might not be ready yet to pay. So we'll have to see how this problem the world is going to solve.
All right. Thanks for that fascinating assessment toward the end, Amit. In addition to, of course, the whole chat being really, really interesting, and I'm sure a lot of us have a lot of tidbits to chew on and think about as we run the marathon to transform public policy. I think, Amit, thanks again for helping us untangle the myths and realities of China's export resilience. And I think for me, the one important takeaway is that even if China's trade dominance has peaked, its surplus continues to ripple across the global economy, and it ensures that the China shock, as it were, is far from over. Speaking of China, please allow me to introduce to you the 2025 iteration of the Takshashila Institution's annual China Challenge survey. The link to the survey is added in the description below. Please take the survey as it's your way to directly or indirectly shape India's foreign policy and make your voice heard on a few key questions that are central to this contentious relationship and this transformative relationship for regional geopolitics. So, do remember to take the China Challenge Survey 2025. Do share it with friends and circles and in circles who'd be interested. And thanks for listening to All Things Policy. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to press the icon for regular notifications and stay tuned for more conversations on economics and geopolitics.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.